Hi guys, welcome to our channel. In this video we're going to talk about all the things you need to know to get a good stable internet connection off-grid. So as you can see from my background here, we live on a boat, but this is totally the same principles if you live in a van or anywhere you can't just get standard cabled in internet with the Wi-Fi router. So Esme and I work full-time from the boat and we plan to keep digital remote jobs whilst we're travelling around, so having a good connection is really important to us. Previously, we've relied on the 4G hotspots on our phones, and actually, a lot of the time, that's totally fine. But there's plenty of moments where you're in a remote location or you only have one bar of signal and it's just not good enough to get online and do a full day's work. The problem is we don't know anything about this kind of technology, so we needed to find someone who does. So for this video, we've partnered with Solwise, who are total experts in all things networking, and I jumped on a call with their technical expert, Daniel, to talk us through the basics of how to get good internet off-grid.
We're Paddy and Esme, and last year we decided to do something a bit crazy. We sold everything we owned, including our flat, and now this is our home, a 40-foot sailing boat called Moonlighting. It's been a long winter of refitting, and we have a lot of work left to do before we set sail on the adventure of our lives. Come along for the highs and lows as we learn more about sailing, ourselves, and our boat, all whilst exploring the world. This is Sailing Selkie. Welcome aboard.
Hi Daniel, let's jump straight in. What are the first things that someone needs to think about when setting up a 4G network on a boat?
They would need to think about where they're going to be on the boat, if it's all going to be in canals, if they're going to be going out to sea, potentially if they're going to be leaving certain areas of like 4G legislation, like if they're leaving Europe, for instance. That's one area they need to think about. They also need to think about what kind of throughput and what kind of performance they really need. Like if they're only anticipating needing to like send some emails, browse websites, browse Facebook, stuff like that. They don't need a high capacity router, for example, especially if there's only going to be, a small handful of people on the boat. But perhaps if it's going to be a lot of people, they want to be doing streaming, that kind of thing, you would obviously have to think of getting an antenna and a router that can handle more. And then other things just like placement, like where is the antenna going to be? What spot on the boat is going to give it the best chance of getting a good signal, whilst also making it fairly, feasible to mount and being able to get a cable from it or cables down to wherever your router is going to be. Those are three main areas to look at first.
You mentioned routers and high capacity routers, and so we've got a TP-Link Archer, I can't remember the exact number, but it's basically a 4G router which you put your SIM into. I think it's got 5G capability as well. What are the kind of major difference between routers? Is that the kind of thing that we would be looking for, or are there other options that might suit our needs?
You can be looking at what's called a Cat4 router, which means a router that has a mobile throughput capacity of 150 megabits per second, and that's a Cat4 router. The next one up from that would be Cat6, and that is basically double the capacity. So with a Cat6 router, you've got 300 megabits per second, and it goes up quite neatly like that. So there's Cat12, which is 600, and so on like that. So that's the easiest way to just immediately tell, and you can kind of think about what your needs are and think about what router you want based on that, and that's an immediate way to classify a router as being too much for what you need, or not enough for what you need, or exactly what you need.
So our router is category 4. Do you think that's sufficient for our needs?
It should be. Cat4 is obviously it's 150 megabit throughput through mobile, and that is going to be more than enough for like 90% of cases.
So should we go on and chat a bit about antennas then? So I think firstly, we have the built-in antennas on the router, but is there a major difference between having an external versus an internal antenna when you're thinking about a boat constructed out of, in this case, GRP plastic?
In pretty much all cases, but especially cases with vehicles like boats and stuff like that, there is a big difference in the performance you see with internal antennas and aerials versus external. And it's not necessarily anything down to the external antennas being stronger, but it's the fact that you can get them outside. It just makes such a big difference. You can probably sometimes make do with the internal ones, but it's just such a big difference with external. You should always try and go for it unless it's completely unfeasible for whatever reason.
How would I go about choosing the right antenna for me? I've seen that there's multi-in, multi-out. Some people use two different antennas. They've got different ratings, different grades, etc., and it's all a bit of a minefield.
For a proper 4G throughput performance, you would need two separate antenna streams going into your router. And so you can get that two streams via either two separate single stream antennas, also called sometimes 1x1, or sometimes CISO, which stands for single input, single output. And in that case, you would get them both separately with separate cables, and you want them positioned at least, let's say, about a meter or so apart from each other. They don't need to be a meter apart. They can be further away. You can have them at different ends of the boat and maybe see, because if you've got two like that, you can experiment with positioning and see what gets the best performance, which is a handy way of handling that. The other common one at the moment is 2x2 MIMO, which is basically an antenna that is technically two antennas built into one frame, if you like, with two separate cables usually coming out of it. And that does the job of two antennas in one. If your router supports more than two, which will usually at the moment be 4x4 MIMO. If you had, say, 1x1, and then you upgrade to 2x2, you're getting about double the throughput performance. So then if you go from 2x2 to 4x4, once again, you're going to get about double the performance. But I definitely recommend doing that if you can, because you'll notice the difference.
What's the difference between, is it omnidirectional and directional?
Omnidirectional and directional are the two main types. An omnidirectional antenna will, get a signal basically 360 degrees all around it, all generally at equal strength, regardless of which exact direction it's in. Whereas directional is the opposite. Instead of being all around, it's just one narrow beam in the way that it's facing. And so they're a bit more niche and specialist, because whereas an omnidirectional antenna will work about equally well, regardless of where you put it outside, a directional antenna will be very inconsistent unless you can get it pointing directly at a mast. You're probably not going to be able to reliably guarantee that if you're in something that moves like a bird.
When I'm looking at different antennas online, they're often rated by dB gain. How relevant is that in making decisions about which antennas to choose?
Yeah, dB, decibels. That is relevant. It's not always relevant in the way that people might think, and it's not the be-all and end-all of an antenna. So the dB gain is how strongly attuned an antenna is in a certain direction. So you'll often find, for instance, an omnidirectional antenna will have a lower dB overall than a directional antenna, because directional antennas tend to be a lot stronger, because rather than being spread out across an area, it's all focused in one narrow point, and so it can be a lot stronger in that point without worry. But that doesn't mean that you can think of it as an antenna with a higher dB will outperform an antenna with a lower dB, because an antenna with a lower dB will have a much easier time of picking up a reliable signal from the area around it, because it's so focused on every direction, and it's sending out its. You can think of it like a low dB antenna will be like that, whereas a high dB antenna will be like that. So you're missing out on a lot of the signal that's in the area around you. So even though it's stronger, if you're missing most of it, it doesn't mean much. So it's something to consider, but you shouldn't just look at whichever one has the highest dB and go for that, because that isn't necessarily a good thing.
Brilliant. That's really good advice, because I'm sure lots of people probably make that mistake.
Yeah, I mean, it's the higher number, so you can see why.
Yeah. So what's the best place to mount an antenna, would you say, on a boat?
As a general rule, you want it as high as possible, because the higher it is, it's going to be raised above more obstructions in the environment. You don't want it to be directly on any other kind of signal device. So you don't want it to be like on a mast that has some other antenna you've got, any other kind of radio type antenna, just because there can be a bit of interference.
Okay, so when you say it doesn't want to be next to another antenna, so for example, on this boat and on most boats, you probably have a radar unit on the mast, and then you probably have a VHF and AIS antennas mounted elsewhere. How close can you mount your 4G antenna to those VHF and
similar? Yeah, similar to if you have two separate single stream antennas, I'd say about 1 meter apart. You're going to be probably fine with that. It's not going to be a big deal. So as long as it's not like right side by side, basically, you don't have too much to worry about.
So do we have to consider how long the cabling is? Will it have an effect on the performance?
So as a general rule, you'll want the cable length to be as short as possible. A lot of antennas come with set lengths of usually either 2 meter or 5 meter, and 5 meter is about the maximum recommended length. I would say 10 meters is the maximum limit. If you're going longer than 10 meters, it's probably not going to be worth it at that point, because you'll be losing so much signal gain that like there won't be any left by the time it reaches the router. Because you want the antenna to be as high up as possible, but you don't want the cable length to be too long. So sometimes you have to, compromise kind of thing.
Yeah, have to find a compromise. Okay, that makes sense why we're not looking to put any antennas at the top of a mast on most boats of a certain size. You're probably going outside those limits.
There is a way around that. If you still want it to be quite high up, you can get enclosures, waterproof enclosures to keep routers in. Sometimes they're also double as antennas themselves, so that you can have the router be quite close to the antenna all the way up, perhaps. And then if you've got like Ethernet cable running from there, bringing the power and the network connection, that's a kind of a workaround of the cable length problem.
So on a 4G setup like ours, with an appropriate aerial, what kind of speeds can we expect?
With a 4G antenna and a good 4G router like the one you've got, you can get anywhere from 20 megabits per second, hopefully at worst, to up to, let's say, could get up to 70 megabits per second on a Cat4 router.
So how do I future-proof my system? So I think I've got 5G capability in the router. Do we need to think about similar things with the antenna, and what's beyond then 5G?
Yeah, a lot of the good 4G antennas nowadays are also 5G ready, which means they support 5G. With good 5G, so like how you can use a 4G router with just one mobile antenna connection, but you won't get true 4G. There's a similar thing with 5G. You can use 5G with just 2 antenna ports on the router and 2 antennas, but it won't be the true 5G performance until you get a 4x4 antenna or 4 separate single ones into a 5G ready router, which has 4 antenna ports on it, 4 mobile antenna ports. So another thing to think about with future proofing is the scalability in that regard. Is it a 4x4 antenna?
So we're planning on traveling internationally. Is this anything that we need to consider with our hardware when we're thinking about using it in different countries?
So obviously one thing to think about is SIM cards. That might change depending on if you got roaming or not. So you might have to get different SIM packages for different areas. And then in terms of the equipment itself, Europe-wide, everything works the same. So there's nothing to worry about there. All abides by the same rules and everything will work everywhere. And then as you go to different areas in Africa, in the Middle East, India, Korea, Japan, they all use most of the same things as well. If you start to go into different areas beyond that, so like Australia, South America, North America, you'll start to run into areas where the routers and antennas aren't always universally supported. So you might need, like if you go to America, you might need a different antenna and certainly a different router for it to work with the 4G signals they have over there.
Obviously, on a lot of boats that are considering doing offshore passages, there is a need to use satellite communications when you're well outside 4G service areas.
Yeah.
Is there any way of integrating satellite communications with the kind of 4G setup that we've been discussing, or will they operate as separate systems?
Well, for the most part, they are separate systems. That doesn't mean they can't necessarily be intertwined in a way. So, like the 4G antenna and the 4G router don't work in any way with satellite communications coming down, and the same goes for the satellite equipment. That doesn't work with 4G in any way. But if you had your, let's say, satellite router managing the actual network that you're on, like you're actually using that as the router, but you wanted 4G as a backup or vice versa, then you can disable, say, the DHCP server on the 4G router, so you're shutting down a lot of its router functions at that point, and then you cable it into a WAN port on your satellite router that is then working as an alternate WAN input that you can presumably on the satellite router you'd then be able to switch between them depending on which one you actually want to use. Like if the satellite isn't very good, if you're in an area with good 4G, you can switch it over and then switch it back again whenever you need.
Okay, so in that situation, would you be able to have your same network and kind of Wi-Fi network that would then you just choose for it to be drawing data from 4G or from the satellite, depending on how you'd set up that switching?
Yeah, you'd be using, in this example, you'd be using the satellite router, presumably, as the main point of the Wi-Fi that everyone's devices are connecting to. And so whether or not you're using the satellite aspect of the satellite router, or whether you're using the 4G of the 4G router, which is linked into it, you would still be connecting to the same satellite router Wi-Fi. So from like a client point of view, it doesn't change anything.
So having chatted through our requirements and the things we're thinking about when designing a system, which kit that you guys stock would you recommend that we try out?
So starting with, we have a range of pointing antennas that they call the puck antennas. So called because they look a lot like hockey pucks in terms of what they look like and also the size. That's a key detail. They're very compact and very low profile, easy to mount antennas. So yeah, they're very versatile in terms of how they can be mounted, and they're very small, so you're not going to be getting into too much trouble in terms of you can't fit them in a certain place. And they're also quite strong, even though they're quite small. So you get like 5 or so peak dB gain on them, which is good. We have another range of pointing antennas called the MIMO range. But in particular, the MIMO 3, there is a 2x2 version and also a 4x4 version. So you can, if you did want to get the highest end kind of setup, you can go for that. Or if it's just a regular one, you can go for the 2x2. And it's got a similar peak dB gain as the puck. It's about 5 to 6, but it's a bit more reliable because it maintains that peak dB gain across more frequency bands. So you'll get a similar consistent level of performance for the most part, regardless of where you are. Those are the two most popular ones we do for people in this kind of scenario. That's generally what people look at. It's one of those two ranges.
Okay, awesome. And then what about routers?
Yeah, so we do a lot of good standard 2x2 routers, similar to the one you've got. And we do a great 4x4 router by Teltonica called the RUT X14.
So after that really helpful call with Daniel, I had a bit of a chat with the Solwise team. We thought it'd be a really interesting exercise to test my existing router and a 2x2 mid-range antenna against a much higher spec 4x4 5G system, see which one performs best sailing around the UK on a sailboat. In this box we have all the pieces needed to make up the two systems that we're going to test. So first of all, we have a 2x2 antenna. I think this is called the puck, but I'll put all the details of exactly what it is in the description. We also have the big sexy Rut X14, which is the 4x4 all bells and whistles router, which is going to make up the backbone of the high-end system that we're going to be testing. And to pair with that, we have this pointing 7-in-1 4G GPS Wi-Fi antenna. So this will make up the high-end system. Additional to that, we've got a bunch of extension cables to run from the radar arc at the back of the boat down to where the routers are going to be in the cabin. So I'm going to go about getting all this set up, probably going to take me a little while, and then we'll test them in a bunch of different locations as we sail around through the spring and summer, and I'll make another video comparing the two systems and having a think about which bits are kind of really crucial that I'd include and which bits you can live without. So keep your eyes peeled for the follow-up video.